Part 2 of Finding Truth by Nancy Pearcey. Principle number 1, Twilight of the Gods. Dylan was not your stereotypical intellectual. In high school, he was an athlete. Football, baseball, basketball, track, you name the sport, Dylan was in the thick of it. As captain of his football team, he had won the Most Valuable Player award and was courted by top colleges. Witty and outgoing, he was a natural leader. Then, in his senior year of high school, Dylan's life took an unexpected turn. His achievements began to seem empty, and he wondered if there wasn't more to life. Through a youth life group and a local church, he heard the gospel and became a Christian. Immediately, he knew that he wanted to live a life completely sold out for God. But when he started college the next year, Dylan suddenly found himself in a fierce battle with doubts and disappointments. In his science classes, Darwinian naturalism was assumed as unquestioned dogma. In his psychology classes, most of the theories from Freud's psychoanalysis to Skinner's behaviorism promoted negative views of Christianity. In his humanities class, his professor told him that Christianity was just a values choice, something that might be meaningful to him personally, but not objectively true. Dylan's church had taught him the basic gospel message, but it had not equipped him to meet the challenges he now faced in the classroom. It had not taught him how to destroy the arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. 2 Corinthians 10:5. Dylan joined an evangelical campus group, and when he raised questions there, the leaders essentially said, "You've got the Bible. Why do you have any questions?" They urged him to redouble his devotional efforts, pray more, evangelize more, memorize more scripture. Yet Dylan was already active in the group and intensive discipleship training program, even living and working with other group members. When his questions refused to be silenced, the group leaders accused him of being proud, thinking too much, and being too intellectual. Having been an athlete all of my life, it was the first time anyone had accused me of being an intellectual, Dylan later recalled with bemusement. Frustrated that he could not find answers, he finally decided the intellectually honest course was to start over and reconsider the case for Christianity from square one. He embarked on a serious investigation of philosophy, theology, science, and biblical criticism. Midway through college, Dylan traveled Europe to visit the country where he was born, and decided to take a detour to visit Le Brie in Switzerland. The detour turned out into an extended visit. There, for the first time, Dylan met people who were not afraid of questions. He heard a case for Christianity that was both intellectually persuasive and practically viable. After nearly a year of studying and discussions with Francis Schaeffer and other Le Brie staff, he was finally convinced that a Christian worldview does provide livable answers to the questions of life. Instead of an escapist attitude of avoiding the world by retreating into purely devotional activities, Dylan found that he could now engage the world with confidence. Does devotion beat doubt? It is a serious mistake for Christian parents, teachers, and churches to dismiss young people's doubts and questions, or to think they can be overridden merely by cultivating a more intense devotional life. Because we are created in God's image, we are all endowed with a mind and a natural urge to make sense of life. My own experience as a teenager was as discouraging as Dylan's. I found it all but impossible to find adults in the church who would take my questions seriously. It may not have helped that I had long, blonde Alice in Wonderland hair. People were constantly asking if I was a cheerleader. Stereotypes like these have done enormous damage, robbing young people of opportunities to find answers to their questions. Athletes and cheerleaders are just as intellectually curious as anyone else, and they need facts and reasons just as much. all Christians are invited to have the mind of Christ. 1 Corinthians 2:16. Because we are created in God's image as rational and responsible beings, we have a philosophy. Not necessarily one learned out of a textbook, but an overall view of life by which we make sense of the world. The biblical view of human nature implies that we are incapable of holding purely arbitrary opinions or making entirely unprincipled decisions, writes Albert Wolters. We need some creed to live by, some map by which we chart our course. If we take the Bible's view of the human person seriously, we need to take questions seriously. Living teens vulnerable. Recent research underscores how important teenagers' questions are. In one sociological study, teens were asked why they fell away from the religion in which they were raised. Researchers expected to hear about emotional or relational issues. To their surprise, the answer that was given most frequently was that teens had unanswered doubts and questions. They told researchers it didn't make any sense anymore. Some stuff is too far-fetched for me to believe. I think scientifically there is no real proof. Too many questions can't be answered. A Barna study turned up similar results in You Lost Me, Why Young Christians Are Leaving Church and Rethinking Faith. David Kinnaman reports that 36% of young adults felt they could not ask life's most pressing questions in church. As a result, 23% said that they had significant intellectual doubts about Christian teachings. In today's pluralistic, multicultural society, teens have to navigate their way through a complex web of competing worldview claims. One study found that the age at which most people leave the church is in the high school and college years. Yet, church youth groups rarely teach apologetics, majoring instead on games and goodies. The goal seems to be to engineer events that ratchet up emotional commitment as though sheer intensity of experience will compensate for intellectual doubts. But emotional intensity is not enough to block out teens' questions. If anything, it leads them to redefine Christianity in purely emotional terms, which leaves them even more vulnerable when they finally face their questions. If my own students are at all representative, teens regard emotional tactics as manipulative anyway. They know it's easy to manufacture an artificial sense of belonging with loud music, water balloon fights, and ultimate frisbee games. But they also know that those feelings burn out quickly. As one student told me, what I hear at my church are mostly feel-good messages. But they also know that those feelings... Oh, shit. Sorry. Retake. As one student told me that... As one student told me, what I hear at my church are mostly feel-good messages, but I don't want to feel good. I want to wrestle with difficult questions. No wonder Christianity Today announced apologetics makes a comeback among the youth. Parents are rightly concerned about the risk involved in exposing their children to non-biblical perspectives. But there is also a risk in raising children who think the only way they can test their mettle is by breaking away from their family and church. Competing worldviews often appear more attractive when they acquire the allure of the forbidden. The only way teens become truly prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks, as said in 1 Peter 3:15, is by struggling personally with the questions. The danger was brought home to me when I talked with a Christian mother who told me, all the answers we need are in the Bible. We should not have to read anything else. In the next breath, she confided that her son had recently gone off to college where he promptly joined a new atheist group and vehemently rejected his Christian upbringing. This mother thought she was protecting her son by avoiding discussions of doubts and difficulties. Instead, she had left him defenseless. Paul warns that Christians can be outwitted by Satan if they are ignorant of his designs. 2 Corinthians 2:11. It is far better for young people to explore the fascinating world of ideas with parents, teachers, and church leaders as guides who can give them the tools to think critically, and think well. As one can give As one of my students put it, exposing the mind to ideas is like exposing the body to germs. It's the way to build immunity. No age is too young to get started. A friend's 8-year-old son asked him, "Dad, people with other religions believe that they're right about their gods, and we believe we're right about our God. How do we know who's really right?" Even a second grader's questions need to be taken seriously. Principle number 1, identifying the idol. Where do we begin? According to Romans 1, those who reject the Creator will create an idol. They will absolutize some power or element inanimate within the cosmos, elevating it to an all-defining principle, a false absolute. When evaluating a worldview, then, the first step is to identify its idol. What does it set up as a God substitute? Despite the vast diversity of religions and philosophies, they all start by putting something created in the place of God. In Culture and the Death of God, literary critic Terry Eagleton lists several idols of the modern age. Enlightenment rationalists make a God of reason. Romanistics defied the imagination. Nationalists idealize the nation. Marxists offer an economic version of sin and salvation. Not believing in God is far more arduous affair than is generally imagined, Eagleton concludes. God cannot be rejected without putting something else in his place. The history of philosophy is largely a history of setting up God's surrogates. It is a history of idol-making. One of the most effective ways to understand history, then, is to identify the prevailing idol. As Timothy Keller writes, every human personality, community, thought form, and culture will be based on some ultimate concern or some ultimate allegiance, either to God or to some God substitute. Thus, the best way to analyze cultures is by identifying their corporate idols. In its teachings on idols, Scripture has given us the key to unlock all of history. There is an exciting insight because it seems Scripture provides conceptual tools not only for ideas that are normally labeled religious, but also for the ideas that are labeled secular. In the Old Testament, Ezekiel calls them idols of the heart. Ezekiel calls them idols of the heart. Ezekiel 14:3. Today, when we speak of the heart, we mean the emotions. But in Hebrew, the word means your innermost self, including the will, the mind, moral character, and spiritual commitment. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. 1 Samuel 16:7. In the New Testament, the Greek word for heart, cardia, likewise means the center or core of a person's being. Thus, idols of the heart are the convictions that engage us most deeply and drive our behavior. We often contrast believers to non-believers, but that can be misleading. Everyone believes something, in the sense that they must assume some principle as fundamentally true. Atheists often fail to recognize that they are in the same boat as everyone else. A common mantra on atheist website goes like this: Atheism is not a belief. Atheism is merely the lack of a belief in God or gods. But it is impossible to think that without some starting point. It is impossible to think that without some starting point. If you do not start with God, you must start somewhere else. You must propose something else as the ultimate, eternal, uncreated reality that is the case and source of everything else. The important question is not which starting points are religious or secular, but which claims stand up to testing. The advantage of using the biblical term idol is that it levels the playing field. Secular people often accuse Christians of having faith while claiming that they themselves base their convictions purely on facts and reason. Not so. If you press any set of ideas back far enough, eventually you reach an ultimate starting point, something that is taken as the self-existent reality on which everything else depends. This starting assumption cannot be based on prior reasoning, because if it were, you can ask where that reasoning starts, and so on, in an infinite regress. At some point, every system of thought has to say, this is my starting point. There's no reason for it to exist. It just is. If starting premises do not rest on reason, how can they be tested? Although you cannot argue backward to the prior reasons, you can argue forward by spelling out their implications, then testing those implications using both logic and experience. This is the strategy we will follow throughout the rest of Finding Truth. It will provide remarkably effective, demonstrating that Christianity outperforms all religion without God. Another advantage of using the term idol is that it avoids a kind of dry intellectualism, as though people choose a life philosophy the way they solve a logical puzzle. When people commit themselves to a certain version of reality, it becomes their ultimate explainer. It serves to interpret the universe for them, to guide their moral decisions, to give meaning and purpose to life, and all the other functions normally associated with a religion. We might even think of philosophies as secular religions. That may seem like an oxymoron, but it makes sense once we know the generic meaning of the term religion. What is the one feature shared by all religions? It's not what you might expect. Does a religion have to affirm the existence of a personal God or creator? Most Westerners would say yes. An atheist friend once argued on my Facebook page, "Religion is a belief in a deity. No deity, no religion." Yet, many beliefs that we classify as religions do not identify the divine with a being at all. In pantheist religions, such as Hinduism, the concept of the divine is not a personal being, but a non-personal, non-cognitive spiritual substance or essence, akin to energy, electricity, or the Force in Star Wars movies. In a popular form, pantheism often does include the worship of local gods and goddesses. But what Westerners often fail to understand is that these local gods are not identified with ultimate reality. They are merely beings in which the divine essence, shared by all humans, is more highly intensified or concentrated. Buddhism goes even further, referring to the divine with terms such as the void or nothingness. That's why, odd as it may sound, Buddhism is sometimes called an atheistic religion. So are Taoism and Confucianism. As one philosopher explains, the founders of these religions are not gods themselves. They identify with no deity, no revelation, no personal or transcendent creator of any sort. Religion without morality. If a personal deity is not required to qualify as a religion, what about morality? No again. Many Eastern religions are amoral. They teach that everything must be accepted as part of the one, the whole, both yin and yang, both good and evil. The goal is the balance or union of opposites. The rituals associated with these religions do not aim at achieving holiness, but enlightenment, the recognition that everything is equally part of the whole. When I was a college student during the countercultural 1970s, I was deeply impressed by Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha, about a Brahmin's son who undergoes a search for spiritual wisdom. In the end, he learns that everything that exists is good, death as well as life, sin as well as holiness, wisdom as well as folly. Pantheism teaches that it is a mistake to draw any moral distinctions. Everything merges into the one. The end result, however, is that you cannot distinguish good from evil, which means you have no basis for fighting against evil. The same pantheism is promoted today in movies like Avatar. On the mythical planet Pandora, all the flora and fauna are connected by a vast neural network that functions as a kind of collective unconsciousness, personified by a Gaia-like goddess called Iwa. Significantly, she is portrayed as beyond good and evil. One of the natives says, "Our Great Mother does not take sides. She protects only the balance of life." What about pagan or polytheistic religions? They too are typically amoral. Polytheistic religions may demand rituals to appease the gods and guarantee good health and good harvests, but often they say nothing about morality. Anthropologist Mary Douglas discovered in her research that there is no inherent relation between religion and morality. There are primitives who can be religious without being moral, and moral without being religious. Indeed, pagan gods are often outright immoral. The Greek and Roman gods were prone to greed, adultery, quarreling, jealousy, and deception. The philosopher Xenophanes explains that Homer and Hesiod ascribed to the gods acts that are to people disgraceful and shameful, stealing, committing adultery, and deceiving one another. Augustine echoed the same criticism of the pagan gods. Their habit is to be instigators and instructors in vice, not its avengers. Some religions even require worshippers to engage in rituals that are immoral, such as temple prostitution or child sacrifice. In ancient Carthage, parents sacrificed their children as burnt offerings to the gods. Archaeologists have uncovered graves containing the tiny, charred bones of infants buried under tombstones with inscriptions thanking the gods that they heard my voice and blessed me. Do all theologies at least involve some kind of worship or ritual then? No again. In ancient Greece, the Epicureans taught that the gods exist but take no interest in human affairs. They do not care if they are feared or worshipped. Aristotle conceived of the prime mover as a perfect and unchangeable mind, which therefore thinks only about what is perfect and unchangeable, namely itself. It neither knows nor cares what humans do. Other religions that practice no worship include Brahmin Hinduism and Theravada Buddhism. Search for the divine. Are there any features shared by all religions then? Surprisingly, only one. According to Cloyser, the only feature shared by all religions is that they acknowledge something as divine, using that word to mean the self-existent, eternal reality that is the origin of everything else. Obviously, they do not agree on what qualifies as divine. They agree only that something is divine. No other factor is genuinely universal among religions. As a result, religions are a lot more like philosophies than most people think. And philosophies are a lot like religions. Structurally, both start with a set of postulates about what is ultimately real or divine. Think of the divine as whatever is furthest back, beyond or behind everything else. For example, in polytheism, the personal gods and goddesses are not the ultimate reality, because they derive from some pre-existent primordial substance, and that is what is actually functions as the divine, even if the term is not used. For example, in ancient Greek mythology, where did the gods come from? The essential storyline is that the universe began as a divine primeval substance called chaos, an undefined, unbounded nothingness. Out of this initial state arose the first gods. The earth goddess Gaia mated with the sky goddess Uranus to produce the Titans, and from the mating of the two Titans came the gods of Mount Olympus, Zeus, Apollo, Athena, Poseidon, and all the rest. Today, it is crucial for Christians to understand paganism, and not just for historical reasons. In Western nations, paganism is growing more in popularity again. Wicca, Druidism, shamanism, and Native American religions. In Iceland, which converted to Christianity in the 11th century, heathenry has once again become a nationally recognized religion. In Britain, some public schools now teach paganism as their religious education courses, including witchcraft, Druidism, and the worship of ancient gods such as Thor. Only weeks ago, as I write, a mother contacted me desperate to learn how to talk with her son who had joined a Wiccan group. Most revived versions of paganism involve some form of pantheism combined with polytheism, in which the gods are regarded as aspects or emanations of a universal earth spirit. Consult a typical Wiccan website, for example, and you will read the text like this: Divinity manifests itself through all living beings. Nature itself is divine. The idol in paganism is nature itself, or a spiritual substance interconnecting all of nature. Philosophers and their gods. Identifying the idol gets to the core of any religion, whether ancient or modern. It also cuts to the heart of any philosophy. The earliest philosophers in the West, the pre-Socratics, ignored the Olympian gods and went back to the original primordial substance, which they called the arche, the source of first cause. At the time, 4 elements were recognized: water, fire, air, and earth. And many of the early philosophers selected one of them as the most basic, then reduced everything else to that single element to arrive at a fundamental unity. Thales observed that all living things need water, and he proposed that the fundamental starting principle, the arche, was water. Heraclitus noted that all living things generate heat and proposed that the arche was fire. For Anaximenians, the divine substance was air. Air is God. Others went beyond the 4 elements. Pythagoras discovered the order in nature can be represented by geometry and mathematics, and he concluded that the arche was number. God is number, number is God. Does the Greek concept of the word arche fit the biblical definition of an idol? Clearly. Whereas Scripture asserts that all things hold together in Christ, Colossians 1:17. The early philosophers sought to identify some principle immanent within the cosmos that provided an underlying unity that functioned as their ultimate explainer. Though they rejected the Olympian gods, the pre-Socratics still held a concept of the divine. The most familiar names among the Greek philosophers are Plato and Aristotle. They taught that the ultimate formative principle within the universe was what they called rational forms. You can think of forms as abstract concepts that make it possible to categorize the world. Though there is vast variety among domestic dogs, from the Great Dane to the tiny Chihuahua, we recognize that they belong to the same category because they fit the abstract concept of the dog. Plato taught that the forms exist in an ideal realm separate from matter, whereas Aristotle argued that they inhere in matter. Yet both conceived the forms as eternal, uncreated, unchangeable, universal, and self-existent. Is this a divinity claim? Certainly. The forms were invoked to explain the nature of things, why things are what they are. Human nature is the form shared by all human beings, and it is what makes them human. Justice is the form shared by all just actions, and it is what makes them just. Forms are the ultimate explainer. Both philosophers even used the language of divinity. Speaking of the realm of the forms, Aristotle says, "Here must surely be the divine, and this must be the first and most dominant principle, the arche." For Plato, the preeminent form is the form of the good. To see the good involves a conversion, a turning of the soul from darkness to light. The true philosopher is the person who contemplates this divine order. In Romans 1, we learn that idols result from divinizing something immanent within the cosmic order. That description certainly applies to the forms. They are not personal, and though they transcend the material world, they do not transcend the cosmic order as a whole. As one theologian explains, Plato's forms of the good is not divine in the Christian sense. It is divine because it is the highest being in the cosmos. Aristotle even defined God as pure form, which means that he, or it, is one pole in the form/matter dialect that constitutes the cosmos. The Church of Physics, the idol of matter. What about modern philosophies? Do they qualify as idols too? The prevailing view among the new atheists, along with much of the academic world, is scientific materialism. What is ultimately real is matter, molecules in motion. Materialism is committed to the dogma that physics explain all of chemistry, chemistry explains all of biology, and biology explains the human mind, with nothing left over. Therefore, physics alone explain the human mind. Physics is the ultimate explainer. Not surprisingly, this view is sometimes called physicalism. A prominent spokesperson is biologist E. O. Wilson of Harvard, who insists that all phenomena, from the birth of the stars to the working of social institutions, are based on material processes that are ultimately reducible to the laws of physics. Biologist Jerry Coyne defines physicalism as the view that all sciences are in principle reducible to the laws of physics. This view, he says, must be true unless you're religious. But is this view itself religious? Is it a divinity claim? Without a doubt. Some materialists admit as much. John Searle says, There is a sense in which materialism is the religion of our time. A science journalist writing in The Scientist is equally candid. In an article about the origin of life, he says, "I believe a material explanation will be found, but that confidence comes from my faith that science is up to the task of explaining, in purely material or naturalistic terms, the whole history of life." He concludes, "My faith is well-founded, but it is still faith." The materialist creed was captured nicely by the late philosopher Dallas Willard. There is one reality, the natural world, and physics is its prophet. The now classic expression of that creed was the popular television series Cosmos. It opened with Carl Sagan intoning in liturgical cadences, "The cosmos is all there is, or ever was, or ever will be." When the series was reinitiated in 2014, with Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson as the new host, fans created a Facebook page to promote what they call Tysonism, defined as a secular religion based on the philosophy of astrophysicist Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson. The page is listed under the category of church/religious organization. As we saw earlier, materialism is really a cluster or family of related philosophies. It is a religion, we might say, with several denominations. For example, when applied to the economic realm, materialism gives rise to theories like Marxism. What are the logical steps that lead from materialism to Marxism, with its economical determinism? Bear in mind that human nature is always defined by its relationship to ultimate reality. If the ultimate is matter, then humans are defined by the way they relate to matter. And how do people relate to matter? They make things out of it. They mold and manipulate it to manufacture the items they need to survive: clothing, houses, tables, cars. In Marxism, the tools we use to shape matter are called the means of production. Thus, the history of civilizations hinge on who owns the means of production. The ownership class maintains its control and protects its interests by shaping the rest of society in its favor: laws, politics, morality, religion, and so on. In this way, economic relationships determine everything else in a society. In Marxism, economic conditions are the ultimate explainer. Hume meets the Klingons. Idol of the senses. Another widely held idol today is empiricism, the claim that the only valid form of knowledge consists of empirically verified facts. You may not meet many people who say, "Hi, I'm an empiricist." Yet, among those who have gone through the public education system, many hold empiricism as a kind of unexamined background assumption. They assume that what we can really rely on are empirical facts, what we can see, feel, weigh, measure. They relegate everything else to the realm of personal opinion or preference. After all, moral and theological concepts cannot be stuffed into a test tube or studied under a microscope. As a result, empiricism does not consider those concepts to be truths at all, but merely individual values and preferences. The infant terrible, or empiricist, was the 18th century philosopher David Hume, who declared that if a book contains anything beyond empirical science, it ought to be burned. Scrutinize every book on the library shelf, he wrote. If it covers subjects like metaphysics or moral theory, then commit it then to the flames, for it cannot contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Is this another idol? Certainly. Empiricism makes an idol of the sensory realm. Whatever is not susceptible to empirical testing is not real. Hume is not a household name, but among the intellectual elites today, he is enormously influencing. A few years ago, a survey of philosophers at leading universities asked which non-living philosopher they most identified with. The clear winner was David Hume. Philosophies also spill out of the classroom and into popular culture. In one episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, the plot centers on whether a character named Kallus is the Klingon Messiah who was returned from death in fulfillment of prophecy. The Enterprise's Klingon security officer, Lieutenant Worf, has to decide whether the resurrected Messiah is real. The android Data asks for empirical evidence supporting the Messiah's claims. It is not an empirical matter, Worf replies. It is a matter of faith. Faith, Data responds. Then you do believe Kallus may have supernatural attributes. As an android, I am unable to accept that which cannot be proven through rational means. Which assumptions are laced through this dialogue? That claims about the supernatural cannot be proven through rational means, that a matter of faith cannot be supported with empirical evidence. By contrast, if you asked Christians for empirical evidence that Jesus was the Messiah, they would probably list historical evidence for his resurrection, factual evidence for the claims of the New Testament, manuscript evidence for the reliability of the biblical claims, archaeological evidence for the events in Scripture, and so on. The Christian message rests on events that can be seen, heard, touched. 1 John 1:1. Yet the Star Trek screenwriters have captured a widespread bias that any statement about the supernatural is by definition irrational. You will find the same bias on display in the comments section under virtually any article on the internet about Christianity. No matter how strong the evidence, any claim that there exists something beyond what can be known by empirical science is attacked as irrational. Yet, to define what is rational solely based whether it fits the tenets of your own worldview is an invalid move because it rules out all other truth claims by definition. You do not even have to investigate the evidence. A serious search for truth does not start by stacking the deck. Inside the Matrix. So far, empiricism sounds like another path to materialism, and often it is just that. If what is real is defined in the terms of what can be known by the five senses, then reality seems to include only the material world. But if you track empiricism to its logical conclusion, it takes a surprising turn inward to the mind. It signals an important trend in Western thought from materialism to mentalism, from matter as the primary reality to mind as the primary. Think of it this way. Empiricism says the only source of genuine knowledge is sense impressions, sights, and sounds. But how do we know whether our sense impressions are true and accurate? After all, we know that our senses can deceive us. Everyone has been subject to optical illusions. Put a spoon in a glass of water, and the handle certainly looks bent. How do we test our sense experiences? The answer is that, for the strict empiricist, we can't test them. It is impossible to step outside my own head to compare the internal images with the external world to see if they match. How then can I be sure that my senses are telling me the truth? Empiricist philosophers themselves soon recognized the problem. In the 19th century, John Stuart Mill concluded that we actually know nothing about the external world. If we examine a table, we might see that it is brown. We feel that it is smooth. We knock on the surface and hear it sound that it's solid, and so on. But those are all senses, color patches and sound pitches in our heads. According to empiricism, our minds construct the concept of the table out of a cluster of sensations. But we cannot step outside our minds to discover what the external world is like in itself. Mill concluded that the material world is nothing but the permanent possibilities of sensation. In that case, however, how do we know that an external world even exists? The most radical of the empiricists admit that, given their premises, we cannot know. There is no way to rule out the possibility that we are characters in the matrix, plugged into a supercomputer that is creating the illusion of a physical world. The bundles of sense perceptions that we interpret as physical objects could be nothing but bundles of sense perceptions. Empiricism ends by claiming that the only thing humans are capable of knowing is a succession of sensations, like a film strip running through our heads. As Morpheus says in The Matrix, how do you define real? If you are talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. Hume seems to have accepted this bizarre conclusion. He wrote, "Let us chase our imagination to the heavens, or to the utmost limits of the universe. We never really advance a step beyond ourselves. We live in the universe of imagination." The same radical conclusion was shared by physicist Ernst Mach, from whom we get the term Mach 1 for the speed of sound. "The world consists only of sensations," he wrote. "Fundamental physical entities cannot be observed, like atoms and electrons he dismissed as nothing but useful fictions." Fundamental physical entities that cannot be observed, like atoms and electrons, he dismissed as nothing but useful fictions. The upshot is that if we begin solely with sense impressions, then we will end with sense impressions. Using sensory experience alone, there is no way to build a bridge from internal mental images to the external world. We are trapped in the prison house of our minds. That is the logical outcome of treating sensation as divine, the sole starting point and standard of knowledge. Sensational Bacon, dubious Descartes. Historically, the main rival of empiricism was rationalism, but it, too, ends up trapped inside the mind. Rationalism claims that the sole source and standard of knowledge are ideas in the mind known by reason. But it is impossible to step outside our reason to test whether those ideas are accurate. Like empiricism, it lacks a way to bridge the gap from internal ideas to the external world. How do so much of Western thought end up trapped in the mind? We must go back imaginatively in history and recreate the intense intellectual chaos at the close of the Middle Ages. The breakup of the medieval church after the Reformation unleashed a century of religious warfare. Thousands of religious refugees fled their homes as Christians literally shed one another's blood in disagreements over interpretations of biblical doctrine. Taking place around the same time was the Renaissance, spurred by the rediscovery of classical texts: Plato, Aristotle, Democritus, Epicurus, and they all disagreed with one another as well. This clash of ideas erupted in what historians call a skeptical crisis. The urgent question of the day was, how can we be certain which of these competing truth claims is really true? Philosophers began to search for some deeper source of truth, not in any of the theological authorities denouncing one another, not in any of the sacred books or ancient traditions competing for acceptance, and certainly not in any of the civic institutions engaged in armed warfare with one another. In fact, not in any external source at all. Their hope was to find a method located solely within the individual, rooted in the immediate data of consciousness. They wanted to start over from scratch and rebuild the entire edifice of knowledge on secure foundations within the individual mind. This hope was the motivation behind both empiricism and rationalism. The founder of empiricism was Francis Bacon. He outlined a program designed to purge our minds of all the popular notions picked up from our education and environment, and to begin anew from the very foundations. What were those foundations? In his view, the simplest, most direct form of knowledge were sense perceptions, sights and sounds. Bacon proposed to rebuild knowledge on the foundation of senses. The founder of rationalism was René Descartes. He proposed a system to purge our minds of every fuzzy or half-baked idea, everything that can possibly be doubted, until we reach a foundation that cannot be doubted. What was the foundation? The one thing Descartes could not doubt was, well, his own mental process of doubting. Even if all my ideas are delusions, he urged, there is still a self who is experiencing those delusions. This is the meaning of his famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. He hoped that clear and distinct ideas in the mind would be the foundation on which to rebuild knowledge. Both Bacon and Descartes expressed some level of Christian conviction. Nevertheless, the philosophies they proposed did not treat God as the final source of truth. Instead, they replaced God with the individual consciousness. As one philosopher says, they turned the first-person standpoint into the only path to certainty. They set up the self as the locus and arbiter of knowledge. This is the core of the modernist project, the idea that if we strip away enough culture debris, received traditions, speculative philosophies, religious claims, in short, anything humans can be mistaken about, we will finally reach something we cannot be mistaken about. Why not? Because it is known not by inference or reasoning, but by introspection into the immediate data of consciousness. Thus, it would be immune to any of the external criticism or challenge. Like the foundation of a house, it would provide a solid, infallible foundation to build the edifice of knowledge. Signposts or dead ends. Clearly, Enlightenment thinkers were seeking a God substitute. Just as Romans 1 says, they fastened on something within creation to serve in the place of God as their secure and certain source of truth, their ultimate explainer, the fixed foundation of knowledge. That's why philosopher Karl Popper speaks of the religious character of Enlightenment epistemologies. The authority of divine revelation was merely replaced by another form of authority, he writes. Baconian empiricism appealed to the authority of the senses, while Cartesian rationalism appealed to the authority of the intellect. Yet both hoped to find a method that would yield a truth that was as certain and as universal as divine revelation. Both hoped to find a method by which the individual could transcend his or her limited niche in space and time to arrive at absolute godlike knowledge, what philosophers call a God's eye view of reality. As philosopher John Herman Randall writes, they were trying to arrive at the complete and perfect understanding and explanation of the universe that only a God could possess. In the end, ironically, that search for godlike knowledge was restricted to the tiny universe of the self. Most philosophies are born when someone stumbles on one of the undeniable facts of human experience, and then claims to have discovered the ultimate, infallible foundation of all knowledge. Bacon recognized that, in practice, no one can deny the testimony of the senses. We cannot function in the world unless we trust the basic reliability of what we see and hear. The entire scientific enterprise is based on the assumption that our sensations provide a reliable picture of reality. But empiricism takes this fact of experience and absolutizes it, tries to make it carry a philosophical weight it is not able to carry. Thus, it reaches a dead end. If you begin with sense data alone, you end with sense data, nothing but a film strip running through your mind. Descartes stumbled upon another undeniable experience, our sense of self or personal existence. Even if we can be induced to doubt everything we know, there is still a self that is doing the doubting. Rationalism takes this fact of experience and absolutizes it, seeking to build a full-blown philosophy on it. But if you begin with ideas in the mind, that is where you will end. You will be trapped in the prison house of your own mind. Every non-biblical philosophy fastens on something in creation, sometimes known by general revelation, and tries to build a system of truth on that foundation. Inevitably, however, it proves too limited to support such an edifice. Our experiences of the created world are merely data that need to be explained. They are signposts pointing to a transcendent creator. We misread the signs if we treat them as sources of ultimate truth in themselves. Invariably, they turn into dead ends. Kant's mental prison, idol of the mind. If both empiricism and rationalism leave us trapped inside the mind, the next step was to claim that there is no external world. Instead, the mind creates the world. That step was taken by Immanuel Kant. His innovation was to suggest the mind does not merely reflect the structure of the world, instead it actively imposes structure and order onto the world. For Kant, reality, as we know it, is largely a construction of the human mind. After all, where do we get our knowledge of the material world? According to Kant, the raw materials of knowledge are sense impressions, flooding into the mind through our eyes and ears in a jumbled chaos. And how do those perceptions get organized into a coherent, intangible whole? By the creative action of the human mind. Kant proposed that the mind supplies the necessary ordering principle, such as before and after, cause and effect, space and time, and so on. The world appears to be lawful and ordered only because the human mind creates that order, like pressing a clay into a mold. In Kant's words, mind is the lawgiver to nature. The human mind took over God's role as lawgiver to creation. This concept was revolutionary, and Kant knew it. He called it his own Copernican revolution. At the birth of modern science, Copernicus had moved the sun to the center of the planetary system. Now Kant moved human consciousness to the center of reality. The primary reality is not matter, but mind, he said. The world of objects is largely given its shape and character by human consciousness. As philosopher Alvin Plantinga explains, the fundamental thrust of Kant's Copernican revolution is that the things in the world owe their fundamental structure and perhaps their very existence to the noetic activity of our minds. And if the mind imposes even the categories of space and time, then it must itself be outside time. Kant called this timeless, changeless mind the transcendental ego. It was not the ordinary, experienced self, your sense of personal identity, but a kind of higher self, a universal mind. The philosophical label for this view is idealism. The term is not used in the ordinary sense of having high ideals. Instead, it means the ultimate reality is the realm of ideas, the mental realm. Instead of defying matter, idealism defies the mind. Instead of making matter the basis of consciousness, it claims that consciousness structures matter as we know it. It makes consciousness the ultimate explainer. Kant claimed that his system rests on a fully secured foundation established forever. When you hear phrases like secured foundation and established forever, your idol detector should start beeping. Anything in creation is proposed as the eternal, unchanging foundation of reality is an idol. Like Bacon and Descartes, Kant was a theist. But what really played the role of the divine in his system was not God, but the human mind. The mind itself was granted godlike creative power. Textbooks often say that Kant's philosophy combined with empiricism and rationalism, so not surprisingly, it shares the same major weakness. On its own premises, there is no way to step outside the human mind and test whether our ideas match external reality. The logical consequence is solipsism, the doctrine that the only thing I can know for sure is the existence of my own mind. Common to both empiricism and idealism is the doctrine that the mind has no direct knowledge of anything but its own contents. Writes philosopher Anthony Kenny, the history of both movements shows that they lead in the direction of solipsism. They leave us trapped within the mind. The artist as God, the idol of the imagination. Despite the flaws in idealism, it was enthusiastically embraced by the Romantic movement. Many Romantics were artists, and they were attracted to idealism because it defined the mind or creative imagination. If the mind is the power that imposes order on the world, creating order from chaos, then the artist is no longer just an artisan, but a creator. The Romantics then, the ultimate foundation for truth was neither the senses, empiricism, nor reason, rationalism, but the creative imagination. They conceived of the imagination as an autonomous power, immune to any outside force, explains Alan Jacobs of Baylor University. It generates its own distinctive kind of truth, unchangeable by other kinds of truth. Words like autonomous, immune, and unchangeable should set your idol detector beeping. The Romantics were claiming that the imagination generates ultimate truth. It performs a number of functions formerly reserved for God himself, Jacob says. It is a God substitute. Poets began to say that art reenacts the very work of God in creating a new world from nothing. Samuel Coleridge described artistic creation as a reputation in the finite mind of the external act of creation in the infinite I am. Johann Gottfried Herder wrote, "The artist is become a creator god." Thus was born the now familiar notion of the artist as a prophet or visionary. William Wordsworth felt that his spirit had been clothed in priestly robe and singled out for holy services. William Butler Yeats said that art became for him a new religion, almost an infallible church of poetic tradition. A book on Romanticism is titled "The Imagination as a Means of Grace," reflecting the religious status assigned to the creative imagination. It is often said that the two movements that kicked off the modern age were Enlightenment and Romanticism, and both were built on idols. Cure for blind philosophers. The first chapter of Romans gives us a powerful method that applies to religions as well as philosophies, ancient as well as modern. Principle number 1 tells us that the way to cut to the heart of any alternative to Christianity is to identify its idol. Each one carves out some aspect of creation and elevates it to a false absolute, a single, all-defining principle. This tendency to absolutize some part of creation is the source of all isms, writes Christian philosopher Herman Dooyeweerd. One part of the created order is treated as the whole. One piece of the puzzle is claimed to be the complete picture. One color in the spectrum is declared to be the entire rainbow. Worldviews are a lot like the characters in the famous poem, The Blind Man and the Elephant. The blind man who caught hold of a waving trunk insisted that the entire elephant was like a snake. The blind man who grasped the tusk argued that the whole animal was like a spear. The man who found the tail insisted that the beast was like a rope, and so on. Idol-based worldviews work much in the same way. Each grabs on a part of reality and declares it to be the whole show. That one part is treated as the set of conceptual categories that explains all of human experience, the key that unlocks the universe. Anything it does not explain is either denied, redefined, or dismissed as unreal. By contrast, Christianity does not start with anything in creation. It begins with the transcendent creator. Therefore, it is not limited in scope. It does not have to reduce all of reality to a single set of categories. It does not see just the trunk or the tusk or the tail. It is a transcendent point of view that sees the whole elephant. The God's eye views that philosophers and mystics have always sought. Though you and I are limited in our individual perspectives, we have access to the perspective of eternity. The joy of critical thinking. The philosophies you are learning in this book from the backbone of all Western thought, the ideas that form every subject area, every academic principle, every profession. When our son took a college course on the history of psychology, I opened the textbook and could have sworn it was for a philosophy course. It started with the pre-Socratics, went on to Plato and Aristotle, covered empiricism and rationalism and Kant, and then continued all the way to the most recent philosophical movements. The textbook was making the point that every psychological theory stems from the application of a philosophy. Other subject areas draw from the same well. Once you master the 5 principles from Romans 1, you will be equipped to think critically and creatively about any theory in any field of study or work. As one of my students said, using this method is like the difference between driving around Los Angeles with a set of directions, turn left, turn right, compared to having a map of the whole city. The map gives you the overall perspective. The 5 principles provided a map to navigate any system of ideas. Students have sometimes told me that the main message they get from reading books on apologetics is everyone else is wrong. A Romans 1 approach offers a refreshing alternative. Because a counterfeit God is something within creation, it leads people to focus on that aspect of creation, which means they are likely to uncover some genuine truths. Consider their idols, the idols that we have identified. Materialism is partly right because God did create a material universe, even pronounced it very good in Genesis 1:31. So we should not be surprised that scientists who embrace materialism can tell us a great deal about the physical universe. Rationalism gets something right because God did create the world with a rationally knowable structure. He also created the human mind with a corresponding structure. Good reasoning leads to God. In C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, the experienced devil warns the younger devil to avoid arguments. By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason, and once it is awake, you cannot foresee the result. That's a good one. Empiricism gets some things right because God did create a world with a sensory dimension, and he equipped humans with their 5 senses to function in that world. Jesus himself validated the need for empirical evidence. If you don't believe my words, he told his disciples, then believe on the evidence of the miracles. John 14:11. When the Pharisees questioned his authority to forgive the sins of the paralyzed man, Jesus responded, But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He left the sentence hanging, turned and healed the paralytic, Mark 2:9-11. Jesus confirmed his identity by giving empirical evidence that was available to any seeking person. When the apostles proclaimed the gospel, they treated their message as public truth, based on eyewitness testimony, open to cross-examination and testing, that which we have heard, which we have seen with our own eyes, which we have looked upon and touched with our hands. 1 John 1:1. They did not preach cleverly divisive myths. They were eyewitnesses of events taking place in time and space. 2 Peter 1:16. What they witnessed were many convincing proofs of Christ's resurrection from the dead. Acts 1:3. What's more, as Paul reminded the Roman rulers, those events were not done in a corner, Acts 26:6. They were public events, witnessed by many people who were still alive at the time, and who could therefore potentially refute the apostles' claims if they had any contrary evidence to present. Romanticism was right to oppose Enlightenment worldviews that reduce humans to complex mechanisms. It was right to assert human freedom and creativity, because we are made in the image of a creator. Christians should be more committed than anyone else to supporting the creative arts. The imagination should soar. A biblical worldview enables Christians to approach every viewpoint with a free and respectful attitude, knowing that virtually every perspective offers something of value. We can glean what is good wherever we find it. We can enjoy the best works of any culture. We can delight in the artistry and the beauty founded in classical works of art and literature. We can learn from the insights found in science and philosophy. We should refuse to allow good works like empirical and rational to be taken words. We should refute to allow good words like empirical and rational to be taken over by secular worldviews. Instead, we should work to fill these terms with balanced biblical content. All the while, we should be making that case when whatever is genuinely good and true finds its true home within Christianity. Every ism isolates one strand from the rich fabric of truth. Christianity alone provides what the greatest philosophers and sages have sought all along, the coherent and transcendent framework that encompasses all of the human knowledge, the good, the true, and the pagan. In every age, Christians have faced the task of identifying what is good and true in the surrounding culture. The Christian church was born into the intellectual climate shaped by the Greek philosophy. The challenge for the church fathers was to design a strategy for addressing the highly literate but pagan culture. Sifting through the prevailing ideas, they found much they had to reject as contrary to the Bible. But also, they uncovered much that was good and right, which they could assimilate into a biblical worldview. The coined phrase that is still common currency today, all truth is God's truth, wherever it is found. The church fathers also passed on a phrase they borrowed from the Old Testament. In the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, God urged them to plunder the Egyptians, Exodus 12:36. Metaphorically, the phrase came to mean appropriating the best of pagan society, including its art and scholarship. Paul himself provides a stunning example when he quotes the literature of his day while speaking to the Greek cultural leaders on Mars Hill in Acts 17. When the text says that Paul reasoned with the philosophers of Athens, the word in Greek is dialegomai, the root of the English word dialogue. In other words, Paul's address was not a one-way street. He starts by acknowledging that his pagan listeners had some insight into truth, even if their groping toward the divine was hazy. I found also an altar with this inscription, "To the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." Acts 17:23. Paul then quotes pagan poetry. "In him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring." Acts 17:28. Close parallels to these lines are found in several ancient literary sources, which means Paul was tapping into assumptions that were widespread at the time. He was willing to appeal to the valid institutions and insights of his Greek audience, even as he corrected and transformed those insights by incorporating them into the biblical universe of meaning. Paul was making the astounding claim that Christianity provides the context of meaning for the Greeks to understand their own culture. The biblical worldview is so rich and multidimensional that Christians can learn and benefit from what is true in all philosophies of life, while at the same time critiquing their flaws and transcending their limitations. First, however, we need to help people recognize those limitations. In principle number 2, we will learn how to show how cramped and dehumanizing idol-based worldviews are. The end of principle number 1.